Welcome, everyone. I'm Kathy Minahan, and I'm president of the NACD New England chapter. We're just thrilled to have so many people here joining us for what will prove to be an important program on climate and what we as board members need to know and bring back to our boardrooms. As you know, NACD is taking a leadership role in addressing the urgent challenge of climate change. In collaboration with the World Economic Forum, NACD has joined the Climate Governance Initiative as its U.S. host chapter. As such, NACD is leading a meaningful conversation about the role of the board in combating climate change. Because of the importance of this initiative, the New England chapter has joined forces with the Connecticut, Philadelphia, New York, and New Jersey chapters to bring you today's program. Corporate directors are the trusted stewards of long-term value creation. And through tonight's program, we hope to deliver guidance and education for you to understand and act upon the risks and the opportunities that the climate emergency poses to the success of your organization. Over 270 people are registered for tonight's event. I'd like to thank Susan Permit from NACDNE for leading this effort, along with the program committee, and for all of the work they do for our chapter. And I really want to thank Connecticut, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and New York for partnering with us on this important task, and I welcome their boards and members to this evening's program. A couple of housekeeping matters. Wouldn't be NACD without housekeeping matters. First, we'd love to see our attendees' faces. While we'll have the speakers spotlighted for portions of the program, we encourage our members to use their video when possible. Next, we ask that you remain muted throughout the program and use the chat function to pose questions. No need to wait until the Q&A portion of the event to submit questions. We'll monitor the chat box during the panel discussion. As always, we ask you to share your thoughts and comments on the program by filling out the post-event survey. You'll receive this by email following today's event. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not thank the sponsors of all 5 of our chapters, and they're here right on the slide you'll see. The continued loyalty of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD. It's their support that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric local programming and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that are vital to advancing excellence in the boardroom. With that, it's my pleasure to bring up Katherine Winkler. Yes, tonight's moderator. Katherine is the former Chief Sustainability Officer and the founder of the Office of Sustainability at EMC Corporation, now Dell EMC. She oversaw the company's sustainability strategy and its implementation. She now devotes her professional efforts to helping guide the next generation of sustainability leaders and to encouraging companies to accelerate and strengthen their aspirations for an equitable and sustainable economy. Katherine, please start the program.
Thank you, Kathy. And a big thank you to Susan, the program committee, and to all of the NACD chapters, and of course to our sponsors. It's a real honor to be here. And I think it's a very important conversation to have. We know, of course, that though the roles of boards in corporate governance is constantly evolving with changes in regulation and public disclosure, and actually in the very nature of modern business, it's also built on decades of precedent and policy that serve as guideposts. But now with the recognition that companies must consider how to incorporate the implications of climate change into their operations, into their strategy, even into their missions, boards are being driven into some uncharted territory. Granted, Climate change can be seen as just another source of financial risk and opportunity, but it's unique in many ways too. Whether it's the undeniable and unpredictable and record-breaking weather events we're experiencing right now, to whiplash-inducing policy and regulatory changes, from the pace of scientific advancement to the breadth of other issues that are intertwined with climate change, equity and justice, access to safe water, human health, migration, and so much more. We're here today because boards are understandably grappling with an onslaught of new terms, with varied expectations from investors, regulators, customers, communities, and even more employees, and with what tools and skills are needed to address those expectations. We're incredibly fortunate to have with us a panel that represents all of these perspectives. They're going to help us understand what roles boards can and should play in helping companies address climate change. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Kyle Bolden is EY's East Region Market Segment Leader for Real Estate, Hospitality, and Construction, a management role in which he works closely with the sector's advisory, tax, assurance, and transaction teams to ensure that EY is bringing its clients leading insights and exceptional service delivery. Kyle engages regularly with management teams and with boards on a variety of topics, including climate change and environmental, social, and governance, aka ESG, disclosures and trends. We have Ron Hovsepian, CEO and board member of Indigo Ag, a leading developer of software tools, data, and biological products to enable digital grain marketing and carbon farming for agricultural stakeholders around the world. He has over 20 years experience of board participation, including his current positions at ANSYS, Valo Health, and Skillsoft. Francis Hyatt is the Executive Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at Liberty Mutual Insurance, where he leads ESG initiatives across the global enterprise. Francis's role is to reinforce Liberty Mutual's commitment to social responsibility, making environmentally conscious decisions, and upholding the highest standards in corporate governance. Francis is a member of the Massachusetts Bar and a member of the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship's Professional Services Sustainability Roundtable. Francis, I almost got through that. It's a long title. David King is head of ESG stewardship at Fidelity Investments. Dave is responsible for expanding Fidelity's asset management approach to integrating ESG factors into the investment process, including publishing thematic research on ESG topics, and developing analytics and company-specific research. In his role, he engages with a broad range of stakeholders and oversees the external communication of Fidelity's ESG program. So welcome to Francis, Dave, Kyle, and Ron. We're really thrilled to have you here. I have the honor of serving as your moderator as we explore the drivers of corporate action on climate, board oversight of climate strategy, and the governance processes and board levers to drive change. Just to remind you, as Kathy told you, our listeners, please ask questions in the chat. Susan Permit from NACD-NE, whom we can thank for putting together this great panel, will be monitoring the chat and may pop into our conversation now and then. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but please try to stay for the optional breakouts afterward, where we'll be in smaller groups and can go deeper and address unanswered questions. So with that, we want to get started with the questions. But the first question I have is actually for you, our listeners. We'd like to know, and we're going to ask you several questions. We'd ask you that you respond to them with respect to one or more of the boards on which you sit. So Diane, let's start with question one. Is climate change on your board agenda? Please take a moment to respond. Yes, on all my boards, we hear from Sarah. That's great. That's good to hear. Oh, I think it's waiting for me to answer. Okay, what are we seeing? Yes, 45%. Not bad, and somewhat, 28%. So we've got nearly 3/4 that are either yes or somewhat, but 1/4 that say no. All right, it's interesting. A recent study actually said that 2/3 of board members agree climate change should play a role in corporate strategy. That number is up 5 times from the year before. So there are some big trends driving this strategy of climate action. Dave, why don't you start telling us what are some of the key trends that are driving this action?
Yeah, it's become a more and more increasingly important topic as we are engaging with companies nowadays. I think as climate action or climate change is really one of the best known of the ESG or best understood of the ESG issues. And really that's come from, relevant changes like the Paris Agreement and the emergence of the TCFD, which really is about creating kind of that framework for oversight, management, and reporting on key climate issues and how climate's impacting a company, how the company is responding, managing that risk, and identifying the opportunities. I think from an asset management, yeah, go right ahead.
I know we're going to go into reporting a little bit later, but and I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you quickly just explain what TCFD stands for?
Yeah, so
Susan's put it in the chat. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, so that's the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, Financial Disclosure, which really creates this framework associated with board oversight, management responsibility for assessing and managing the risks of climate change within the business, and reporting, so creating more transparency. I think for us as an asset manager, we're hearing it from multiple angles to more formalize how we're assessing E, S, and G risks. And climate is one of the larger risks associated with our investments. And understanding how companies are addressing the downside or the inherent business risks in their company, as well as capitalizing on the opportunities that climate change presents, be it new business models like Ron is working on, or be it new products or services. So, as we're looking at this, asset managers are starting to create their own ratings and assessments on companies. And we need clear, consistent, and comparable data. And that the TCFD framework actually serves two purposes. One is identifying or creating kind of more clarity around that data and what gets measured and reported, as well as ensuring that management or board oversight and responsibility associated with it. I think we're also hearing it directly and indirectly from, or seeing it from our regulators and governments. Part of the Paris Agreement is kind of those direct commitments from countries that they will reduce their emissions. And by doing that, they're doing it either through regulation or soft regulation through, Green New Deal policies, green infrastructure programs, things like that, which actually create even more business opportunity. I think also as corporate directors, and I'll stop in a second, Catherine, is you're hearing it from activists and from your shareholders as well, not just asset managers, because you're seeing greater greater numbers of shareholder proposals and asset managers being more active in supporting some of those shareholder proposals, as well as, you're also just kind of more broadly seeing it from regulators as well.
So Ron, I think Dave name checked you. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what's driving Indigo Ag.
Just as we look at what's driving Indigo Ag, it's just coming up with other tools for boards or companies, most importantly, to create places to store carbon, right? As part of our offsets, the whole concept that we're focusing on is a concept called additionality, and creating the highest standard by which we could use 1/3 of the Earth's land mass to create a carbon sink, which is farmland. So this is a series of practice changes that the farmer would make, and we would pay the farmer for that behavior. And we estimate that we could take about 0.5 gigaton out of the Earth's atmosphere of carbon and sequester it back in the ground and enrich the soil for the farmer and for all of us to produce better foods. That's the quick headline of what we're doing. And I think it all ties back to where Dave was going, which is, as a board, and putting that hat on, it's really about long-term value creation as we look at the companies, and all the companies have customers, and customers are demanding more and more. We're seeing on the food side, we're seeing organic growth rates at 15% demand on organic food. We're seeing 6% for healthier foods. And we only see those trends growing, which is ultimately going to impact what people buy, which ties all the way back to what Dave said about, hey, look, these are going to be value creation moments for companies, and smart companies are going to think that through, and smart boards will be helping those companies think it through.
Yeah.
That's great. Francis, you're in a very different industry from
very
Ryan.
different in property and casualty insurance, Katherine, thanks. Climate change for us, while it's critical certainly in current day, it's not new in the insurance industry. As you can imagine, the impacts of climate have been impacting our policyholders for decades. And so for us, understanding risk, making sure we have a good analysis and assessment of risk exposure from a climate perspective in our book of business is critical. And that certainly applies to our investment portfolio as well, because as we have premiums invested on behalf of our policyholders, we need to understand really the impacts of climate on the investment portfolio. But it's broader than that, right? Because if you insure folks, you have to make sure your products and services evolve as risks evolve in the world. And so understanding whether it's from a commercial transportation policy or whether we're talking about commercial property, how are we building greater resiliency into our products and services to protect our policyholders? What are we doing in terms of understanding the impacts of climate and our transportation fleet in terms of GHG emissions, et cetera? But it's a huge issue for us and something that we care deeply about and spend a lot of time not only talking about, but focusing on from a data perspective.
So Kyle, you talk to a lot of different companies. What are the main things that are making them, try to up their game a little bit on climate change?
Or hopefully my audio is coming in okay. I think really I'll touch upon some of the points that the other panelists highlighted, which, it really starts with stakeholder engagement. I think historically, folks have looked at it from a shareholder standpoint, but now, people are looking at it through the long-term value lens and focusing in on stakeholders. And stakeholders is very broad, right? It includes communities, customers, supply chain, employees as well. And I think when you focus in on employees, that's an investor base that is very powerful. We actually saw that at a large technology company a couple of years ago when they pressed their organization for what are you really doing around climate change, and so and that actually resulted in actions that were taken by the company to really focus in on how do they reduce their environmental footprint. So employees are a very, very powerful stakeholder group. The other thing as well is the rise of the retail investor, right? I think we've seen that with with those who invest through venues like Robinhood or what have you. Those investors are very powerful as well, and they have a voice. And I think the thing that's really critical to focus on there is, millennials as well as Gen Z, they've really identified climate change as a top 5 issue. Depending on which group you're talking to, whether it's millennials or Gen Z, it's in the, it's either a top 3 issue, if not in the top 5. And so I think that really highlights again in terms of when you think very closely and carefully about climate change, you have so many different constituencies that have a voice in this all, and you just need to be responsive to it. So we are seeing that. Certainly we're seeing it in the boardroom, but we're also seeing it, as I said before, with supply chain, with the workforce, and certainly it's something that's in focus at the senior management level, particularly CFOs.
Thank you, Kyle. I want to ask each of you, you brought up specifically, Kyle, climate action and the result of the employee action at a tech company. And starting with Francis, but I'd like each of you to sort of, what are the top, first things that companies ought to be doing in the area of addressing climate.
Oh, that's a great question.
Francis, why don't you pick us up?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I would say when you think about climate and the impact on a business, risk assessment is super important. So I would start with an organization assessing the risks associated with climate for their business. And in our case, it's for our policyholders in our book of business. And because I think that what that risk assessment does is gives you a good top of the mountain view of what the hotspots are going to be for the organization and for the business. And it helps inform some of not only the strategy, but really operational plans to address issues from climate. I would say maybe the next thing is to really understand disclosure. So, Dave talked earlier around the task force for climate related financial disclosures, but disclosure is broader, whether you're a public company or a private company, and really understanding the universe of disclosure and what is going to be expected from your organization in terms of transparency is critical. And so that would be another key factor that I would really encourage folks to look at. I think taking a look inside the organization in terms of our own impact from a greenhouse gas perspective, understanding the impact of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, which is really, GHG emissions from your operations, from your energy usage, from transportation, from your book of business, et cetera, is critical because it gives you an idea of your own contribution to the problem. And, I think Kyle spoke real fluidly about the different voices that we hear, but certainly our employees, non-governmental organizations, activists, they're all looking to the corporate community to ensure that we act. I might throw out next the idea of, in terms of impacting our GHG emissions, what's the role of RECs and credits? So, certainly we don't want to greenwash our way to a greener world, but at the end of the day, there's a place for RECs and credits strategically as we think about how to impact the issue of climate. And then maybe lastly, I would just end with stakeholder engagement. Whether it's our employees, whether it is NGOs, whether it's our policyholders, whether it's the broker and agent community, or lastly, but not leastly, the activist community, engaging in a dialogue about the issues that are important to those folks and understanding what those issues are and how material they are to our business, I think is critical. So really, those would maybe be the top 5 that I would tick off, and I'm sure my colleagues have others that they would want to add.
Dave, you're laughing.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think, Francis, you hit the nail on the head. Those are a lot of the aspects that we're looking for authenticity and in a corporate response and oversight in kind of for climate risks. I think it's really important. Target setting is an important exercise as well. In the end, it's giving us, because I won't repeat everything that you said because it's very true, but building on that would be the target setting and the reporting, because that's what's going to give us the opportunity to assess the effectiveness of management and the programs being put place. What are the yardsticks or the goals being put out there? And how well are you driving toward that? That's truly important to us to then understand where we're going. Because I think the disclosure although important, it tells us where you were 6 months ago, because that's the best that the data is going to give us. Once it gets through, once year end happens, it gets through corporate compliance and lawyers and things like that, then it finally gets reported 6 months later. It's a great flag to place in the ground. But it's where are you going? And so an important part of our process is engaging and talking to management, talking to directors, understanding how this is being managed, where it's being managed in the board structure, how you're overseeing it, how you're getting updates. And then we can measure it through the disclosure.
I'm going to have a little fun with it. I'm going to take a slight turn. I think all this risk stuff, the insurance guy has to go risk right away, comes naturally to him. I think there's a bunch of great, thank you, Francis. I think there's a bunch of revenue opportunities that we should all be thinking about to create value here on behalf of our companies. There's a social responsibility, there's an employee dimension, and Indigo, in our case, we're a mission-driven company. We have a lot of young, smart people here who care about the planet. So I'm seeing it firsthand, the next generation of employees, with our average age only being about 33. It's incredible and it's real, and we all have to get used to that because that's going to impact our company. Well, if I'm building industrial products, I'm going to have those people feel really good about what we're doing. So think in terms of words like handprint. What am I doing to help my customers change what they're delivering for products, right? So as we look at our board responsibilities, I'll put my board hat on to build on what Dave said and Francis said, is we've got to go out and reach out to them. I personally, as chair of ANSYS, I called 16 investors of ours, and I spoke to them, listened to them, tell me what your ESG process is. How are you assessing our company? What do you think the baseline should be? And the takeaways for me were, it's still young in the market right now. People are defining it. It varies by investor group. It's rapidly changing. And there's a set of mechanical things that are absolutely important that we discuss. And I think there's a set of business dimensions here that we have to stay focused on, equal to, all kidding aside, Francis, equal to what we're doing from a risk perspective, because I think opportunity here is critical for these companies as they go forward. And I think our companies can all play a big role as we look at this. So just taking the other side of it and pushing it a little bit over on that side of what a company can do in this new world, I think
I
is
love
all.
that, Ron. I think you're spot on. And, I didn't say it earlier. I referenced products and services, but just to give a nod to what you're talking about, even in the financial services world, we're so focused on climate right now that the next big thing that we're focused on, which is sort of greenfield, is resources and ecosystems, right? Like, what's the role, for example, of a large insurer in protecting and preserving green oceans, biomes, forestry, et cetera? And you couldn't be more right. And I'm really glad you said that, Ron, because we do need to get away, in some sense, from this risk-based view and embrace innovation in this space and embrace the future. What's the next big rock that we have to solve for once we've figured out the solution to decarbonization, which it sounds like you've got it, Ron.
We got a portion of it. We're part of a big team that's got
Oh,
it.
sure, of course.
We're attacking the agriculture piece.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
And to Francis's point, number one issue I hear from the farmers, hey, can you get me crop insurance for moving to regenerative practices? It's really fascinating. So this is real, what Francis is highlighting, and I think it's a great thread for us to all think about as board members.
Hey, Kyle, I want to ask you, along with sort of what you think that the key things are for companies, a question that came up in our audience as well, and it's one that's that I've been thinking about also, which is how aggressive should they be? I recently saw a proposal to a company that was just starting, and its strategy said, first thing you should do is set a net zero goal. I mean, can you talk about what companies really should focus on first and how aggressive they need to be?
Sure. And I think some of it was definitely covered by Francis and Ron, but I would start off by telling you that the regulators are keenly focused on this. And so back in March of 2021, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they actually started a climate task force to understand what the impact of climate change is on publicly registered companies. And then on top of that same month, essentially they asked folks to respond in terms of, I think there was something of maybe good questions asked in response to climate change, and then should there be a separate report? So I would start off by saying that there's certainly the insurance risk that Francis touched upon, but there's also the regulatory risk. In terms of the question of how aggressively companies need to get and proactively, getting after it, shareholder activism is, it's one of these things where I've been told it's theater and politics, but what activists are really looking for is a wedge into the company, and that wedge today may be climate change, it may be ESG. It doesn't matter if they see a vulnerability. Organizations that aren't really, focusing in on climate change. When you had the polling question earlier, that 1/4 of companies don't have climate climate change and climate risk on their agenda, well, that's a signal to an activist that there may be a vulnerability there that they can exploit. And so to me, the very first step that folks should be taking coming, as we approach this quarter's board meetings is to start the conversation, right? Make sure that climate is on the agendas. Francis mentioned before risk assessments. So this is right around the time that boards are starting to think about the enterprise risk assessments. And so this should definitely be something that's on high up on the list. And then the last thing I would say is I would sort of really look to spread this around. I think oftentimes what happens is a lot of these responsibilities, whether it's cyber, whether it's ESG, whether it's climate, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it tends to fall on the audit committee. And so I think that really, this is really all of the board's responsibility. And so I'd maybe start looking at the nominating and governance committee to really to make sure that you're building the bench strength. Start identifying board candidates today that could really fill that slot with that expertise to sort of round out. And I think we saw that with the ExxonMobil activism campaign, where ultimately the activists ended up getting a couple seats on the board and bringing that expertise to the table.
I think really you've taken us very importantly to, what are the responsibilities of the board? But before we go there, Diane, several of our panelists have talked about the importance of goal setting and forward looking. So it'd be interesting to understand from our attendees if their corporations have adopted emissions goals. Could you go to polling question number 2 and 3, actually, or 2? That'll be fine. Has your corporation adopted climate goals? You can skip the untitled question below that. All right. While we're waiting for the answers, I think I think you started on exactly the point, Kyle, about boards and what are boards doing. And certainly that's why we're here today, to understand that responsibility. So I'd like to go to our board member, although all of us, I think, are on some board or another. But Ron, maybe as we get to the results, you could start speaking about what the role of responsibility, what the role of boards are in the strategy. And we do have the results. So just a quick 56% say not yet. So that's really interesting, Dave. You were saying where are companies going in goal setting? So we do have 12% that say science-based targets. There are some net zero as well. But over half still don't have goals. Ron, what's the board's role in getting some goals there?
Let's break it into a couple of pieces. First, the simple roadmap that everyone should be thinking about is really a bunch of the pieces that everyone has touched on as panelists. So let's simplify it. One is get your baseline in order. Understand what your footprint is today. The next step is really where Francis went, is really understand the risks and exposures to the business. Where are those pieces of the carbon being generated from? Where are we producing bad products and we're having waste go into the system, whether it could be water or other things. So understand that breadth and depth of exposure and risk that your company has. And then thirdly, shift the conversation to the planning, both A, looking at the risks, and then B, looking at where you can grow going forward. The ways to think about that are, okay, do we have a chief sustainability officer, right? As part of this company, is the company big enough? Where are they on their journey? So that should they consider those pieces? How does it fit into the future product strategy for the company? And engage with your investors. These are critical steps to understand what's happening and what the investors are thinking about. If you haven't spoken to your top 5 investors, 10 investors, go listen to them. Have them explain the program to you. I saw a wide diversity as I listened to the investor base of those 16 that I referenced. And those 16 shared with me their different views. Some of them were broken by each fund. Some were run across the entire financial investment firm. So it really does vary. So you have to pay attention to that segmentation. I think that will continue to evolve. Then it's getting the mechanics in order behind that, making sure that you do have the proper disclosures, because this is something that's on a journey to being heightened and tightened. You're going to see more heightened on the prioritization of what happens on the board agendas, and you're going to see the rules behind it get more scrutiny as to what goes into an offset. This is going to be something that's going to be taken extremely seriously in terms of the credits, and I see some questions showing up with quality of credits. That's going to get really hot. I'm just warning everyone right now. The voluntary task force on carbon emissions, for example, a lot of us use forestry carbon credits. They just eliminated all the ones from prior to 2016 and back. You're going to see the tightening of this as things move forward. So think about it in those layers and think about it in that planning process. And hopefully that generates some more conversation, Catherine.
But how does how does the board actually engage in each of those layers, Ron? So for example, in doing the footprint, in understanding your baseline, in goal setting, in engaging with the stakeholders that have been talked about. You obviously engage directly as a CEO. Do you do that as well as a board member?
I did that as chairman of ANSYS, actually. I have a private board, so I'm in that situation, and my whole life is built around what we're doing for sustainability. So I can't hide from that. I have to live it, breathe it, and execute on it. I'm saying it really from a board perspective and the board seats that I sit on. And ANSYS, is roughly a $30 billion market cap company, playing in the simulation software space, to give you a feel for what they do down in beautiful Pittsburgh. So it's a really nice, exciting company. And we've taken a very aggressive point of view, and we went out and embraced it. So the process we went through, Catherine, was one that we picked up the phone and called them. I took 16, and I also had several other people in the Nom and Gov committee reach out and speak to them so that we had a bunch of input. Second thing that we then did with that was realize very quickly that baseline is coming towards us fast. And if we don't get that baseline in order, we're going to be in trouble. So that was a good awakening for me, which is why I gave you the suggestion. Just start with your baseline, know your footprint, understand that measurement, understand your risks and exposure. What are your top 3 things that emit your carbon or emit or do bad things to the planet? You better know what those top 3 to 5 are, and you better understand what your long-term or short-term game plan is to address that. And that's part of that planning process. Second part that I throw into the planning process that I'm seeing right now on the carbon market side of it is these offsets that people are going to want to buy, they're going to come under incredible market pressure because I don't believe there's going to be enough to go around. And therefore, the early bird gets the worm on this one. I think the boards that plan effectively and think through what the offset footprints are and the timeframes, it's going to make a big difference to that board over time. So I can't implore you enough to think through that planning piece. It doesn't have to be done tomorrow, but it's got to be done in the near term by a board.
Well, I think that's a fantastic point. At work, as I'm trying to help people understand the place that offsets and recs and credits can play, I've actually had to educate them about the fact that they're becoming commoditized. We went from a period of time where it was easy to get recs and credits and the cost associated with them was fairly stable, to now seeing a pretty steep incline in terms of the price associated with them and the availability that you were mentioning. And I couldn't agree with you more that companies that aren't strategic about their view of how they're going to capitalize on the rec and credit market are going to be left behind. It will be disappointing for them.
Yeah, that's the real surprise. So for I'm sorry, Kath, for where we're doing in carbon and farming, it's going to take a farmer 2 to 3 years to actually produce a ton of carbon, right, out of that acre. So I've got to take them on a journey to generate that ton. So you're already 2 years behind, let's just say, right? Just right out of the blocks. Secondly, the additionality standard approved by Vera internationally and the Climate Action Reserve requires me to soil sample that farm every single year, starting with a baseline. And it went through a 9-month, 21 scientists approval process. This is as high a standard I've seen in the market. And it's great because it'll create this voluntary market. I now have companies approaching me offering anywhere from $27 a ton now, and I haven't even issued the first credit in the market. That's what I'm looking at. That's why I'm sharing this with you about doing your planning and homework. I'm seeing it on that side as well for what we run in the company, and then I'm seeing the planning part on the board side of it. So you probably have a little schizophrenia for all of you to enjoy.
Yeah. You know, I wonder too, for many of our listeners, though, we heard 56% of them, I think, have goals. So there's always planning going on, Ren, as you're talking about. It's constant because there's so much new information and change, but at the same time, wanting to move toward these goals. And I guess on a day-to-day basis, what is the role of the board? I mean, does the board engage in the organization and the selection of the CSO? They approve goals? Do they approve disclosures? How do you want them to help you, Francis?
So a couple of things. One is that, so I've been in.
Or not.
No, I want all the help I can get, Katherine, that's for sure. I think a couple of things. So first of all, when I've been in the role a little over coming up on 2 years actually. And while management selected me for the role, the lead director interviewed me before it was made final. And it was a very clear signal to me that our board cares and cares deeply about the work that we're doing. And so I would say for those that are on the call that are considering what their actions are going to be, the board should get involved. They should get to know who the sustainability officer is. They need to understand not only the person's technical capability, but candidly, the person's sensibilities. How will they react? What are they going to do to be driving change? How are they going to be seen as leading in this space? Because it's a big, big push for an organization to make these commitments. I think the other thing is, and there was some conversation, I think Kyle brought it up, and I certainly heard Ron bring it up in terms of where does accountability sit for sustainability in the board? In early days for us, it was sitting with the big board, and I was giving updates on a regular basis to the big board. But that might be too burdensome, right? So we need to really get specific about which committee of the board. Does there need to be a specific committee of the board? You know, for financial services and insurance, how does the risk committee, the audit committee, and the sustainability work come together so that we're not redundant and we're respectful of the board members' times and we're being very clear about who's covering what and what's the overlap. I also think that, and at our company, you know, we just appointed a new board member that is an expert in climate and sustainable investing because it's critical to us. So as we think about board composition, ensuring that we have folks that really understand the E, the S, and the G issues and are bringing technical expertise to the table, influencing how management is going forward. To me, that's a big deal. And then certainly oversight of strategy and what we're doing from an operational perspective, I think are critical as well. So maybe I'll stop there and let my colleagues jump in as well.
Well, I'm going to pick a question out of the chat because I want to throw this one to Kyle and Dave, perhaps, which was about Patricia says, so for financial and banking institutions, impact on climate change is not as apparent as manufacturing. Some are thinking they're waiting to hear what the SEC comes out with in terms of minimum required disclosures. Is that a good strategy? What do you recommend for them?
Guess I'll go first. You know, I'm not sure I would wait for the regulators to sort of tell me what to do. I think it's really critically important to get ahead of it. You know, I think when you look at financial institutions that, you know, we haven't mentioned Larry Fink yet on this webcast, but certainly when you look at BlackRock and you look at what he said, his statements about, you know, not investing with companies that, you know, don't have sound, you know, sound strategies around climate, around ESG, you know, dollars move pretty quickly and it could be a pretty seismic shift. And so, you know, to me, regardless of which industry you're in, whether it's finance or healthcare, I work in the real estate industry. And, you know, I would tell you that first movers are going to really be the ones that are the organizations that are going to be around for the long term. You know, there's leaders, there's you know, fast followers, and then there's laggards. To me, if you're not a leader, you at a minimum want to be a fast follower. But I would certainly not wait for the SEC to come through and provide the regulatory framework, because what will happen then is you may inherit things that you don't actually, want to have sort of, burdened upon you. I think, I know this is a webcast about climate change, but, we saw last year around human capital, specifically as an output of ESG, where the SEC came out with a principles-based approach around about human capital disclosures. And, the word on the street is that's going to really move more toward away from principles-based and more rules-based. And so I would use that same analogy as I think about climate change. It's really going to be important to get ahead of that. The last thing I would say as well is organizations, whether or not your organization itself is a scope emitter, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, you still have folks in your supply chain as well. And so a financial institution is going to need to look to, their vendors, and they occupy a lot of real estate. And so it's going to really be incumbent upon them as well to understand who within their supply chain is sort of a bad actor when it comes to climate.
So to build on that, as an asset manager, Kyle hit the nail on the head. Our customers are expecting, or our retail investors and our institutional investors are expecting us to assess the climate change as part of our investment selection, portfolio sizing, things like that. Now, as I put my lens on as an investor, and I'm looking at financial services companies, there are many ways that climate change does play in directly to their business. If you think about, a large bank, their corporate lending portfolio, which is a large part of their revenue generator, we have to look within that to understand the climate sensitivities in their lending portfolio for the long term. Are they, how their exposure to fossil fuels, things like that? We're very dependent right now on, and the disclosure is evolving on that, which is really important. So those financial services companies, that is a very difficult analysis to create. And as we've been engaging with them, they're slowly moving forward, building out that analysis so that we can understand their climate exposure in their loan underwriting, their investment banking business, things like that. Francis is square in the middle as a financial services firm and PNC, and understanding the risks of climate exposure, and then the opportunity side of it. So we're looking at the companies through that lens. They might not climate and their greenhouse gas maybe footprint directly through their operations might not be the most material thing, but their exposure to climate change through the products and services that they underwrite or create might be very material to our kind of long-term outlook on a company.
And
Dave,
sorry, Catherine, I was just going to add just an anecdote to what Dave said, which is, we're a mutual company, so we're not publicly held,
right,
but we're owned by our policyholders. So our access to capital comes through folks that are going to purchase bonds from Liberty Mutual, long-term bonds. And I had the opportunity and privilege to, speak with them last year. Their level of questioning at a granular level about issues that Dave just brought up related to fossil fuels, subsector analysis within fossil fuels. So think about things like pipeline, oil sands. For a minuscule part of our book of business, the level of focus, and I mean minuscule part of our book of business, the level of intensity of questioning was pretty surprising, refreshing, but surprising. And I just think Dave hit it square on the head, which is that, the financial services industry has a responsibility and a burden to really understand their book of business, whether it's banking or insurance, to be able to answer these difficult questions. Because to Ron's point about the future, we have to be able to develop products and services that are journey-based for the fossil fuel industry as they transition to more renewable forms of energy production. And in order to do that, you have to understand your baseline and figure out where we're going with them from a products and services perspective. It's so important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. I mean, this is building on, as we've been talking to lenders about their portfolios, you know, there's always a conversation about their subprime exposure, things like that. Now it's a conversation about their climate exposure in those. We're starting to even look into, you know, securitized bundles into mortgages and understand, you know, our climate risk within, you know, these are bundles of mortgages that have been packaged up, commoditized, and sent out to the marketplace. And we want to understand where those mortgages are to understand the climate exposure, climate risk associated with it. You know, every aspect of lending has a climate risk that people are starting to peel back on and really start to ask those questions.
The takeaway for all of us as board members, putting on my board hats, that they're both touching on just now, and Kyle set it up nicely, is you got to pull it apart. You got to pull the business apart and understand the pieces. And that could be mortgages and financial services. It could be a supply chain in a manufacturing business. The job is to pull it apart as a board and really understand where those high dimensions of risk are. That's where we have to, as board members, have to think about it and consider what the impact is in the company and to the company over time. Good news is no one's holding a gun to our head at this moment, other than these crazy temperatures that we're all experiencing. That's probably the real gun that we should pay attention to here. But that piece of board responsibility has to be determined and planned thoughtfully now as we look at it. So understanding asking those tough questions that Francis and Dave were just touching on, and I think are really, really important. You have to understand those as a board member.
Well, so that brings me back to a basic question, something that's sort of mentioned several times. Francis, you said that initially you started with the whole board having responsibility, but it's too much. But you've also just touched on so many different aspects of the business and strategy and ways that they have to think about it and explore. So, you know, where does it belong on the board? How do you handle something so big and yet make it manageable? Does it belong in a special committee, audit, nominating?
You want me to start, Katherine?
Well, I'm going to start. Let me start by asking Dave, do you judge companies at all to some extent, their sincerity by how the board is organized? And what do you look for?
So we are agnostic as to where climate responsibility sits. Does it sit with audit risk? As Kyle mentioned, everything gets piled onto the audit risk committee at times. Is it whole board? I personally, as you know, my own personal convention is that I'm looking for the board to be responsible for it. Whether, you know, and for the board to be updated on it on a regular basis. If there is, and for there to be a fulsome conversation during the board meeting about this issue. Now, does it have to be on every board agenda? No. Is it all the detail? No. Subcommittees should be taking on their respective responsibilities, but then bringing that to the larger board to have kind of that fulsome conversation. That's very important. So hopefully I dodged that well enough, but I just want to make sure that the board is very articulate in who is overseeing, like that there is a responsibility and a conversation there.
I think, Francis, I'm going to cut you off and pay you a compliment. I think the journey Francis went on of taking the whole board as part of that journey, begin the journey as a board, there's too much learning here to share and to figure out on this one. So I think the board for the first year or two, till you know the baseline, till you have the plan in hand of what you're doing, I would be more tempted to keep that front and center for the first few cycles. And then as it matures, like all good processes, you can then move it as Francis described and what his experience is. And I thought that was practical and logical. And, you know, this is all about common sense on this journey. Sorry, bud.
That was great.
It's interesting. We have a comment also about saying that N&G, nominating and governance, tends to be where things end up when people don't know where they belong. or don't know what to, or don't have time to deal with them. So I thought that was an interesting strategy.
So Catherine, that's an interesting comment, and maybe I would ask, not necessarily have an answer for either my colleagues or folks want to pop it in the chat. And nominating gov is where things might end up if you don't have an answer, but does it have to be static? And can you evolve the charter of the Nom and Gov committee and maybe even change the name of the Nom and Gov committee to be something that's more inclusive and representative of what the specifics are? I don't know. I obviously have fairly focused experiences in insurance, but I have to believe these issues are coming up all over the place.
Diane, can we ask, just a second, I just want to ask Diane, while you're speaking, maybe you could put up polls for questions 5 and 6. How does your board oversee climate and which committee? So it'll be interesting to see how that spreads out.
I can
Go
do
ahead, I'm sorry.
one poll at a time. I can only do Catherine.
Okay,
How they're set up.
thank you, Diane. So who did I cut off? I'm sorry.
It was me. It was Kyle.
Kyle, over to you.
So shameless plug, but I would say that, boards should also, leverage experts as well. Obviously, speaking with your external advisors, whether it's in your accounting firm or otherwise would be good. If you look on, my firm's website, we have our global climate risk disclosure barometer, which certainly gives insight in terms of how companies are sort of looking at the increased focus on climate risk. You can do the same thing with the other Big Four accounting firms. You can look at all the specialty advisory firms as well. Those are great resources. I always tell my clients, exploit my firm. We have a lot of folks, that specialize in particular subject matter areas. If you just take, outside of climate change, just take tax, for example. There's not an expectation that all of the tax knowledge resides within the organization, public or private. I would say it's the same thing when it comes to climate, when it comes to ESG, et cetera. So don't be afraid to, as a board, what I'm seeing, at least in my clients, is that the boards are actually inviting outside speakers to come in on a periodic basis to provide input into special topics. And so this is a way that I would say, in addition to making sure that you add climate to one of your next agendas, maybe add this to your agenda as well. Either have someone within the company, your chief sustainability officer, come in and educate the board about what the company is already doing, or do it in tandem with outside, outside in perspective as well. So the point is you don't have to assume that or expect that all of that knowledge necessarily resides within the company board.
But do they need more than they have now? Boards in general? Do you think they have the level of expertise to know which experts to bring in and to take in that knowledge?
That's why they have folks like NACD to answer that question. But I would say that being on a board is no different than just being in corporate America, or just being a certified, whether it's a CPA or a lawyer, what have you. There's always continuous education. I think if the expectation is that you're going to take that role and coast, you're probably better off, letting someone else take on that role. So to me, as a board member, I would expect that you're a consumer of information. Ron can certainly chime in a lot better than I can as a sitting board member, but my view would be that, part of the continuous education of a board member is understanding, all the different changes.
We look for that. We look for education on of the board on these issues. We want to make sure we look for expertise, but then also kind of a broad training or education, an ongoing piece of this, because it is evolving. So it is very important.
So maybe we could find out if that's what's actually happening on the board. So Diane, maybe question 7, polling question. Take a look at what the state of the boards is now. On the previous question, we found about a third use the full board, about a third have a special committee, and about a third do not. Is climate competence included in your board search? few minutes there, or moments, I should say. Ron, one of the questions was whether the processes that boards have been undertaking for years need to change in other ways in order to address and by the way, we have nearly 3/4 do not include climate confidence. So there's information right there. What else needs to change?
Yeah, I believe that like any good business, we have to anticipate, and boards have that same responsibility to anticipate, and look around the corner and help the CEO and the management team. Wearing my day-to-day hat running a company, it's a little exciting every day, right? So you need help and you need guidance from your board to look around the corner, whether it's reporting or whether it's planning. So here in terms of the board evolution, and there's a lot of great chat going on right now around nom and gov versus audit versus new committees being created. I would share in this thread, Catherine, that we should all think about it situationally. I think following a situational construct of where's your company, where is it on that journey, and where does it fit? At the macro level, know that this is going to be a growing part of it. But there's some questions in there about healthcare as an example. Well, what do I do as a healthcare provider, right? What role do I play? I've got my carbon footprint, but how's that going to really affect my business from a health insurance perspective, right? How do I understand that? What do I understand? Parts per million of ingestion in certain countries is through the roof in terms of what's happening to people's pollutants that are coming into people's bodies. So these numbers are only going to continue to grow unless we tackle some of these things. So I believe at the board level, if I were to simplify it, we have to make sure that we understand what is around the corner. And what I see around the corner is a need to be very measured and thoughtful about what we're doing, very integrated at the board level, and not be afraid to create the committee that does go off and look at it. It's okay to embrace it. Go out and understand those things firsthand in your company as well as with your investors. And more importantly, you're going to have a new set of investors. $1 trillion has moved into the ESG class by last August. I am sure it's higher than that now. I am sure it's much higher than that now. What are they looking for as investors? How do they want to deploy their capital? Where will that capital go? We have to help the CEOs see that and make sure that they know where it's going and understand where the market is moving. So I think understanding those dimensions. And when I look at the board, you're going to see financial data emerge. The different pieces around sustainability will emerge, reporting will emerge. Those are all really good things. I think the most exciting thing that we should understand is, should you understand and put on your books what your carbon footprint is as a liability? I'm going to be a little daring here, right? Is that a liability, right? Is that a liability of your company? Now, we know our friends in the energy industry aren't going to run to that model anytime soon. But if you want to be challenging about how to make impact happen, that's the kind of questions we should be asking ourselves. And again, I'm not promoting run to that, but I think it's one of those questions that we should think through as a board and be provocative to ourselves. It'll be a good way to test yourselves to look around the corner harder. Because when you do that, it gets really interesting really fast. How do you remediate that liability? What are you doing with that liability over time? Right? It gets really, really fascinating. So I think those pieces of what's going on in the market are what I would be looking at. And I'm trying to put it in the form of questions. And one of the best lines that our marketing teammate came up with at Indigo was, "From questions we grow." So we use it a lot inside of our own building, right? We got to keep growing and learning. So I think it's a really good question, Catherine. And sorry to get on the soapbox there, but let's look around the corner on this one.
I think it is really important. I think you mentioned your footprint, getting a handle on your carbon footprint. And we've used the term scope 3, but not really explained it. But in the chat, I'm still seeing a lot of sort of hesitance. Well, or question, if I'm not in manufacturing, and we explained finance, but suppose I'm in services. We sit at our desk, we give guidance to other organizations.
How was yesterday?
Kyle, well, we can hear somebody, not muted. Kyle, you're in the services industry. Can you help people understand why this is as important to the boards for services companies as well as manufacturing and financial?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would tell you that you know, services companies, right? We're some of the largest contributors, right, to carbon emissions, right, with corporate travel and things along those lines. And so, you know, I think when I look at what all the service firms are doing, particularly, you know, in light of COVID, all of the service firms are being very thoughtful about their carbon footprint. You know, whether it's extending business trips, so making for longer business trips as opposed to fly in, fly out same day. I think that's certainly one thing that corporations are doing that are in the services industry. And it's not to say that we're going to, you know, I know there's this sort of fear that you know, even after COVID, corporate travel is going to end or you know, be curtailed, you know, dramatically. But I think it's just really about being more thoughtful about, you know, how we have an impact on the environment. For example, my firm has a calculator which we use to determine, okay, if we travel, you know, from point A to point B to point C in the same day, what equivalent of, you know, trees, trees being torn down does that sort of translate to? And so I think it's really about getting everyone to just be more thoughtful about their impact on the environment. This is everyone's responsibility, right? It's not just the responsibility of real estate companies or the responsibility of technology companies or healthcare companies. It's all of our responsibility. This is our planet. And so, you know, that's the way I sort of view it. We're all part of the supply chain. And so I don't think that service companies should be given a pass, nor do I think that, oil and gas or real estate companies should bear the full burden of it. I think this is a shared responsibility of all companies.
Kyle, so let me be a little bit provocative here, though this came up in a recent conversation. You talked about, your direct impact. Does it impact how you address your markets, who your customers are, and which businesses and which markets you target as a services business, and should it?
A bit of a provocative question, but I would point to, I would point to, for example, again, Larry Fink, right? I think that there's certain industries that, he's expressed and on behalf of his investor base, certain industries he's expressed not wanting to invest in. And so I think that to the extent that, there are certainly certain industries that we do not service. Certainly those that are not legal here in the U.S., and you can suspect which one I'm referring to there. But I think that it's equally important. Our brand reputation is equally as important as the organizations. And so, the short answer is, we would want to put our dollars toward organizations. We would want to put our efforts towards organizations that we believe share our view around long-term value and long-term value creation.
We have some questions. Thank you, Kyle, regarding standards and standardization. And Ron, you talked about things that were coming. There has been brief mention of SEC and expected SEC disclosure requirements. What else is happening to standardize this? I know I used to say that reporting was wagging the sustainability dog because we were doing so much reporting in so many different frameworks. Will we be seeing some convergence to the things that matter or matter most?
Yeah, I do believe you'll see convergence. I think you'll see it kind of bifurcate. I think you'll see the private sector actually become much more active in driving a number of the behavioral changes and standards out there. You'll see some de facto standards emerge. Case in point, Indigo is trying to build one of those de facto standards. I don't think we need to wait for anyone. We're pushing it along ourselves, and we're going to create the highest quality additionality sequestration standard in the world, and that's what the goal is for this company. I think others will do the same thing, the creativity piece. I think then there's the reporting pieces that are super important that will fall into what I call the mechanical or procedural part of what we do. And I think that's also going to get much more standardized. And so you're going to see the standardization of either registry credits or governmental compliance controls will be put in place. It's going to happen either at the country level or it's going to happen through some of the private sector. And I think it's important I think the private sector, and I'm not just saying this being a private sector person, I think the private sector can run faster. We love a good capitalistic opportunity, and I think these are the kind of things that will give birth and rise to new companies and new ideas that can create a lot of positive progress and get some de facto standards into the marketplace for us to use. And then I do believe compliance will also happen in certain countries and certain level where they're going to force things to behave in a certain way. It's going to add more complexities to companies and what their compliance responsibilities are. Just looking in the food industry alone, we've identified about 80 different certifications that we need to have on behalf of some of the food supply. So it is complex. And I do believe in order for us to move at the right velocity, we're going to need to do more to simplify that, standardize it, and drive that in a more effective manner for companies to be efficient with it. We can't put that burden of cost all on the consumer. The consumers are willing to pay, based on the latest studies I saw, up to 35% more for a sustainable product. Okay, that's great. People who have to eat, at least the data that I've looked at, people most likely on this call can all afford to be sustainable and healthy from their eating. There's a portion of the population that needs the lowest price. And we can't forget about them on this part of the journey as well. So we need to make sure we pay attention to both pieces of the equation at the company level as a board member, right? We need to look at what does that mean as these things bifurcate and as we look at where this market is going overall. So hopefully that's helpful.
Tremendously. Other comments from the panel?
So I think we are seeing, from a overall disclosure standpoint, definitely seeing action from the SEC this year for comment. I see it on climate. I see it coming on human capital in the longer term for standardizing some of the disclosure. I will say there is an alphabet soup of disclosure frameworks out there between CDP, SASB, GRI, everything in between. We are very involved in the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board and how they're focused on helping create some measure of normalization or standardization of reporting. It's important for our portfolio companies because they want to know what investors want. We want consistent, comparable data. So we want everyone reporting to a standard. They are working across a lot of these reporting frameworks to standardize and get to metrics that can be reported and fulfill different frameworks and standards. That's really, really important because we don't want corporates spending untold number of hours, man hours, working on just putting out metrics that are slightly different and then to meet each provider's needs. So that's very important. And I'm seeing that kind of move forward from outside of any regulatory framework, but just as kind of investors, portfolio companies, asset owners, all working together to figure that out and standardize that. That is great. I do see or assume that, you're seeing it in Europe right now, a mandated framework for reporting on, funds being green or brown or light green, shades of green. So you're also seeing companies having to report on those, on their climate information as well. That's going to move west. I will not be surprised. What I want to make sure is that, and I would encourage companies to keep your eyes open for what's happening in other regions. It might not be in your purview right now, but understand what other regulators are doing, because some form of it is going to appear here in the States.
We have touched lightly on so many things, and we still haven't hit half of the things we want to talk about. However, we are going to have to move forward given the time. So I'm going to ask each of you to share your last comments, particularly focused on, you know, the people here, what they can do when they go back to their boards. What questions should they ask? What should they try to drive? And what's your final message? So I guess I'll go clockwise on my screen. So Francis.
Oh boy. Well, so as the management guy, I guess what I would say is that I'm hungry to hear what the board has to say from a directional perspective and influencing strategy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I would just encourage board members to ask a lot of questions, you know, get involved in understanding sort of what the direction that the organization is going, and don't be afraid to ask questions that, as Ron said, focus on what the future is going to be versus the tactical work that we're trying to accomplish to get at some of the work that Dave was talking about. And that will be my start, I guess, Catherine, and we'll see what my colleagues have to say.
Thank you, Francis. Dave.
So it's a journey. It's definitely a journey. And for boards that have not started it, my recommendation is just get on the starting line and move forward. We don't expect a fully evolved and fully realized woke board day 2, but we do expect a board that is starting to ask what Francis said, ask questions, look for the baseline, like Ron said, begin there, and then start to actualize, and then realize how the impact that you can make kind of longer term, and challenge your management team to set and drive that strategy, the long-term strategy, and advise them. So that's really important. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Dave. Kyle.
So I would say that plagiarism is the greatest, the most complimentary form of flattery, right? And so I would direct folks on this call to the World Economic Forum. They published 6 ways company boards should prepare for climate risk. And I'll just rattle them off real quickly. 1, start the conversation. 2, know your ESG blind spots. 3, if this, then that scenario planning. 4, build your environmental reporting protocol. 5, hold your organization accountable. And 6, strengthen your bench. And so, you know, to me, the key of all of that is, you know, you asked me about board education earlier. I just think that boards need to just be consumers of information. Read, ask a lot of questions, talk to your board peers, and then compare across. If you're on multiple boards, compare what your companies are doing, you know, across the board for consistency and best practices. And then lastly, you know, leverage NACD.
That's wonderful, Kyle. Thank you. And Ron, you get the last word, sir.
Well, the good news is all my teammates here and panelists, I think, hit the salient points. The only things I'd reemphasize here is this is a journey. It's not a 5-minute fix. Don't run into your next board meeting pushing this to be solved in 2 seconds. I think that's an unrealistic expectation. However, I think you surface it with the chairperson and let she or he drive that conversation. Get it on the agenda is your first task, and then be ready to go on that journey and keep it on mark or on point for the discussion. Get that baseline and plan in order would be the 2 things I'd reinforce. The last thing I'd want to just challenge ourselves with and think about is the life expectancy of your CEO versus the life expectancy of this framework that we have to put in place. They don't always match up, shall we say, right? The CEOs may not make it that long, right? So CEO sometimes stands for Chief Executive Officer, and sometimes it stands for currently Executive Officer. And as you look, little Boston sense of humor, come on team, work with me. As we go forward and we look at this, you have to build a framework that withstands the test of time. And that's our responsibility as a board and oversight, because you will have management changes that occur. And as we go on that journey, I think that's the second part. And the last thought I'd leave you with is think through the durability of what that framework is that you're going to put in place, that is the right thing to do for those shareholders in the long run. And that would be my closing remark.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Ron, for that last comment. It's something that isn't talked about often enough, and I think is really critical. All of you, your experience and your contributions have been amazing. The people in the chat, you have so many great questions and comments and are helping each other. I do hope you'll be able to stay for the small groups so we can dig into that a little bit. And with that, thank you again, and I will turn it back to Kathy, the chapter president, New England. Kathy. Can we bring you back onto the screen?
Mute, right. Katherine, thank you so much. This was an absolutely amazing panel. Oh God, everything happens at once. Anyway, I took so many notes and I learned so much, and I'm going back for sure to my several boards to start asking these questions. I expect to be laughed at first, but I think you've given me certainly enough to back up whatever I've got to say and make people stop smiling and saying, oh, there she goes again, and really starting to hopefully focus on this as a major risk issue. So I really appreciate this panel. It's given me a lot to think about. Kyle, Ron, Francis, Dave, I feel like I know you after this panel. You were so engaging and so thoughtful, and we can't thank you enough, all of the chapters who sponsored this. Now I've got to make a few announcements. We're deep into planning our upcoming calendar year. We have an incredible lineup. This certainly is a program that exemplifies that incredible lineup. On September 2nd, we'll be continuing our systemic racism series. This is how not to do it rather than to do it. With that, that's a joke. With our program, Anti-Racism from Inside the Boardroom. Again, a major topic now, and one that all of us have to work on. We have a tremendous panel, including Tony Coles, who's the co-chair of the Black Economic Alliance and executive chairman and CEO of Cerebral Therapeutics, Lee Pelton, president of the Boston Foundation and just stepped down for being president of Emerson College, Kiana Schmedo, global head culture and inclusion at Wayfair, and Micho Spring, chair of Weber Shandwick Global Corporate Practice and president here in New England. September 22nd, I am so thrilled. We are going to have our first in-person event in roughly 2 years. And I'm just thrilled that we're going to have 3 CEOs, Niran Chaudhry of Panera Bread, Bob Rivers from Eastern Bank, Prahlad Singh from PerkinElmer. The program is called The Visionaries Speak, and they're going to talk about their perspectives, consumer-focused, financial-focused, tech-focused, on the challenge and the opportunities in the coming year. Again, the event is in person, so you have to reserve your seat because we will have a sellout. A couple other things, we're going to have a customer engagement program on October 14th in combination with women corporate directors, a private company series focused on successful pivots during the pandemic, the role of the board in human capital management, November 17th, and on December 9th, our in-person Director of the Year Gala, again, first in a couple of years. We're going to hold our annual proxy season review. So you should be watching your email here, NACDNE, and maybe we'll pass some of those emails on to our colleagues in the other 4 chapters working with us, and we hope to hear from them as well. If this pandemic has done nothing else, it has made it possible for us to have amazing programs involving people from all over the country on the topics that we all need to hear about in depth from people who really know what they're talking about. So I can't thank all of the panelists today enough. I can't thank all of the people from all of the chapters enough, and I can't thank our sponsors enough. Now, as Katherine mentioned, or you're going to get your post-event survey, please give us a good grade. We want to thank you again for joining us. And as Katherine mentioned, you're going to be divided into small discussion groups. They'll run for 15 minutes. We're not going to kick you out if you're mid-sentence after 15 minutes. But I hope you enjoy this opportunity to engage with a few people and really dig down into some of the issues our panelists have mentioned.
And
So,
Kathy, if I
now-
may,
yes, sure,
if I
Katherine.
may, obviously people can talk about what they want to talk about from here, but we suggest you start the conversation with what are your boards doing and what do you need to do differently? So,
Good point,
sorry, Kathy.
Catherine. Good point. From the surveys we took, there are a lot of boards that aren't doing much yet and are not organized as yet. So that's a challenge for all of us to really give some thought to how we get our boards to really focus on this and really be engaged and do things. Set a plan and do things. Again, it can't be overnight. I know Ron was eloquent on that topic, as were the rest of the panelists. It's not going to happen in a year. It's probably not going to happen in 5 years, but we got to get serious. So thank you, everybody. And I think we're going to split into groups now, right? Tell me I'm right on that, Deb.
You're right. I'm going to split you into groups right now.
Great,
Bye.
thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
I know. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. You're wonderful.